Hello, class. This lecture is a bit different, a bit unique. In my in-person section of Environment and Society, this is a class section that we do as a live stream. So most Novembers, I go to the annual UN Climate Conference. We have begun taking Houghton students there because Houghton is accredited with the United Nations to be able to attend and get badges for observers from Houghton College to attend there. So I've been bringing students to these. And that's where I'll be in November. So my in-person section, we're planning to do a live stream from Egypt to my class to talk about the COP. For the online section, you guys, the course wraps up before November, which is too bad. So I pre-recorded this one just based off some other presentations I've done. And I'm going to skip some things that I have in here. The goal for this is to get you thinking globally about the climate crisis. So like to adopt a mindset of getting outside of our American context to be able to think about how does the world engage with this particular topic. First of all, the context, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, is the UN body that the Paris Agreement comes out of, that the annual UN climate conferences, the COPs, come out of. The UNFCCC is the body. It's an international organization and under the UN umbrella that convenes the world together to talk about what we're going to do about climate change. And specifically, the goal of the UNFCCC is to stabilize greenhouse concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Anthropogenic, just a fancy word that means human caused. The point here being to prevent dangerous levels of human caused global warming or climate change. So that's the goal of the UNFCCC. It does this by convening the world together to talk about it. So the primary way that the UNFCCC seeks at that goal right there is by bringing the world together. That's what the UN does. It doesn't enforce things. It's not a global government. What it does is it convenes the world to talk about issues. So the UNFCCC convenes world leaders to talk about particularly the topic of climate change. It does this primarily at annual conferences of the parties. So these are parties to the UNFCCC, or these are called COPs, COP, Conference of the Parties. So annually, these COPs take place ever since 1995. The most recent of which was COP26. That's the 26th Conference of the Parties. As you can see, they go up sequentially in Glasgow last year. And we had a Houghton student who attended that. But you can see I listed some of the more important ones, and particularly COP21 in Paris, which is where the Paris Agreement comes out of, is certainly the most important. But also the third COP in Kyoto was the world's first attempt at a global agreement to address climate change. And then a few other important ones there. The next one being COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, this coming November. And so it'd be useful to pay attention to that and see what's going on. The Kyoto Protocol was the world's first attempt under the umbrella of the UNFCCC, the first attempt to try to address the COP, to try to address climate change in a big way. Now, some interesting things about Kyoto. First of all, and you see this on the picture, the nature of the Kyoto Protocol, it only required developed countries or wealthy countries to act to reduce their carbon emissions. Now, I'm curious, what do you think, why did the Kyoto Protocol only focus on wealthy countries? Here's your question to pop up. So, of course, we've talked about the discrepancy between those most primarily responsible for causing climate change, wealthy countries, and those who are disproportionately impacted, much of the rest of the world, particularly less developed countries. And that reality, which, of course, we understand as we've talked about it in this class, it makes sense, of course, to put the focus on reducing carbon emissions on the burden of wealthy countries, because they're primarily the ones who caused it, and still today are primarily the ones causing it. Now, of course, you'll notice in here, China's not on this list. China, under the Kyoto Protocol, had no responsibilities, like much of the rest of the world. Now, in 1997, when this was signed, China's economy was not nearly what it is now. Yeah, it was growing by that point, but not nearly to the extent that it is today. Of course, today China is the #1 leader in carbon emissions, though on a per capita basis, it's way behind the US. But in 97, that definitely wasn't the case. So there's some real limitations to this, obviously, that if China and India are not involved in the process, and now they're big emitters, and Brazil as well, then you're always going to be limited in what you can do. But the biggest problem with that, and you'll see that US and Australia didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And that's because, think of the politics in the US, where you have a global agreement on an environmental topic, so already edgy, already controversial for conservatives particularly, and much of the world's not participating. The only countries participating are the wealthy countries. Well, that doesn't play well to conservative politics in the United States, and so the US never ratified that. There's no way you're getting a treaty through the Senate with requiring 2/3 majority, supermajority, to approve a treaty. There's no way you're getting that through if China and India and much of the rest of the world isn't participating in that treaty. So that was a problem with the Kyoto Protocol. Now, Kyoto was successful in that it was an experiment. It was a useful experiment to get things moving, and a lot of countries met their targets, particularly the Eastern European countries, but didn't work out very well from the US perspective. But think about from a global perspective, this makes perfect sense, right? The countries that are historically most responsible should be the ones taking the most action on that. And the other countries, many of them still mired in poverty. So how can we expect countries that are impoverished to reduce their carbon emissions? Think back to 1997. Is that fair to expect that if the wealthy countries aren't doing that? Of course not. So that's helpful context. Now, Paris Agreement, very different approach. The world learned from the failure of Kyoto. Well, some would say Kyoto succeeded because it was an experiment that we tried, and that some countries reduced, and the overall goals were met, but didn't have participation of US or Australia. US, of course, being the dominant carbon emitter. So we learned, and we changed things with the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement has been much more successful. As you can see, this map looks at parties to the Paris Agreement, and all but 4 countries have ratified it. Every country has signed it, actually. Every single country in the planet has signed the Paris Agreement, and only 4 have yet to ratify it. They're mostly minor countries that you see in yellow here. So everybody is party to this. Everybody's playing in it. And the way the Paris Agreement does is it focuses on voluntary reductions called nationally determined contributions. So each country comes with their voluntary reduction of this is what we're going to put forward as our country's goal for what we're going to target. So NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. So for example, the US comes forward and says, hey, we're going to reduce 50% by 2030. That's the US's current goal. China, on the other hand, says, hey, we're going to peak emissions by 2030. They're not even planning to reduce them between now. They're just going to increase before 2030, but they're going to peak at 2030 and then reduce after that. Is China's goal. Now, is that appropriate for China? Well, you could debate that. But China, on a per capita basis, is still very much a growing country. There's still a lot of people trying to emerge out of poverty in China, and much of the rest of the world is the case as well. What these NDCs allow to happen is for you avoid the problem of Kyoto, where only the wealthy countries have responsibilities. Under the Paris Agreement, every country has responsibilities. They set a goal, they work toward achieving that goal, and report on their progress. However, where it comes in to be advantageous for less developed countries is the goals are all voluntary. So less developed countries like China can set a goal of we're going to peak emissions by the state and then reduce after that. And that enables that flexibility. Or countries like the US that have controversial politics involved, there's flexibility to that because this is not a treaty that needs signing by the Senate. It's an agreement, voluntary agreement. There's nothing enforceable in that. So that creates some flexibility there on a global scale that enables to be more flexible for countries to meet the targets in their own way. I don't want to get bogged down in this, but one issue I want to bring up for your awareness is this idea of climate finance. Now, we've talked about how wealthy countries are disproportionately responsible for climate change, whereas poorer countries are disproportionately burdened by the impacts. Of course, less developed countries also have fewer resources to be able to respond to the ways that climate change is impacting the world. And that brings up this idea of climate finance. So coming out of the Paris Agreement is this idea that wealthier, more developed countries who have primarily contributed to climate change should provide financial assistance for less developed countries to be able to adapt to climate change and to be able to develop their economies in a way that doesn't further contribute to it. So countries like Kenya or Nigeria or Peru, or pick any other developed country, is still in the process of developing economically in order to address the humanitarian and social and economic and poverty concerns from those countries. But they need to develop in a lower carbon intensity way, a less polluting way, a way that doesn't contribute to climate change. We don't want those countries to develop in the exact same way we did, because that will wreck the planet. But they do need to develop. So that's where climate finance comes in, this idea that wealthy countries should contribute toward financially helping those other countries develop and helping those other countries adapt to the ways that the climate is already changing, as we've read about before. That's where the idea of climate finance comes in. The agreed upon goal was $100 billion per year from wealthy countries to less developed countries to meet that need. As you can see, we're not there. As of 2019, we have only mobilized about 79 billion, so not quite 100 billion. And a lot of people say 100 billion is not nearly enough for that. So we haven't mobilized what we need. Also, as you can see in this chart, far more of that is going to mitigation than adaptation. And the less developed countries are saying we should have about a 50-50 split. It should ideally aim for half to mitigation, half to adaptation. What you're seeing is that a lot more is going to mitigation. Well, that's good that a lot's going to mitigation, but a lot more needs to go to adaptation in order to build resilience in those countries that are already facing those kinds of impacts. The only thing I want you to get from this, don't worry about the details other than what I'm about to say right now, and that is most countries are not paying their fair share. So if you look at fair share, if we were to like sort of plot it out equally based upon gross national income and say, okay, if every country in the developed world gave 0.22% of their gross national income toward climate finance, that would meet our $100 billion goal. Well, there's only 4 countries doing that: France, Germany, Japan, and Luxembourg. Good on those countries for doing it. The US is way behind. So this line right here, the purple line, is the amount that needs to be given in order to meet the goal. The US is way below that purple line. We're giving 0.03. The goal is 0.22. We're giving 0.03. So we need to increase about 7-fold to get there. Again, a lot going on. Just look at this one number right here. So this column, fair share, this would be what the fair share is. If you look at gross national income and just plot it out equally among all the countries, the US should be paying about 43% of the total world contribution toward climate finance. That would be our fair share based upon our income levels. Because the income in the US, gross national income, is up roughly on par with all of Europe combined. And yet, our amount is measly. We're giving about 1.8 billion per year. Our fair share would be 43 billion per year. So the US is a significant laggard behind in terms of climate finance. Again, think about this from a global perspective. You've got all these countries that are on the front lines of climate change impacts that are also trying to develop their economies. The only way they can do that in a way that doesn't wreck their country because of the way climate change is impacting them is to get assistance to do that, financial assistance to develop. And the internationally agreed upon goals are not being met. And some countries, like the US, are really behind in doing that. So that creates all of this like international relationship tension between that. Another problem, a lot of it's coming in the forms of loans, not grants. Loans are just not helpful. They have to be paid back and they further contribute to debt. Most of these countries already have big debt problems. Loans only add to them. I mentioned Japan and France are meeting their goal, their fair share, but most of that's in terms of loans, not helpful. Norway, good job. Most of that's grants, not loans. That's great. But this is problematic. I'm going to skip over loss and damage. Interesting issue, important issue. But for time's sake, we're not going to go there in this one. Right now, we've seen about 1.2 degrees of warming. Again, remember, we're trying to keep it under 1.5, definitely under 2, hopefully under 1.5. We're well on our way to passing that. And this line right here basically looks at what a sustainable level per capita emissions on a global scale, 2.3, excuse me. This is tons of CO2. If everyone in the world emitted 2.3 tons of CO2 per person, that is what we would need to limit warming to 1.5. As you can see, the world is way above. The world average is way above that. We're way exceeding that. And some countries like the US are quite a bit. But we've come down from our peak about 20, 30 years ago. So we've come down, but not nearly enough. So what went on at COP26 in Glasgow? Well, there's a lot of important things, a lot of important commitments that were made, pledges to reduce methane, deforestation pledges. A whole bunch of countries submitted these new, we talk about NDCs being, this is our goal that we as a country are going to do. A whole bunch of countries submitted new ones. That's great. Now they need to turn that into action still. A lot of private organizations, automakers and financial firms making good commitments, et cetera. So a lot of good things coming out of that as well. The official outcome of COP26 is something called the Glasgow Climate Pact, which included a variety of things. For the first time ever, fossil fuels were mentioned in the Paris Agreement. Fossil fuels are not written in the Paris Agreement at all. It only talks about greenhouse gas emissions. For the first time ever, countries agreed to phase down. Initially, most of the developing countries wanted us to commit to phase out fossil fuels, but the US and the European Union did not want to phase out fossil fuels. They just wanted to phase down. So that, I'm sorry, India, I think in the US, not the EU, objected to that. Glasgow Climate Pact reinforced that $100 billion climate finance goal and commits to increasing the portion from adaptation. We still haven't met 100 billion either, but working towards that. And some other things that are a little bit geekier and perhaps less interesting for some of you. What does the world say about this? Let's look at this. Let me pause this. Okay, this is a short video summarizing a lot of the statements made by negotiators at COP26. And I think this is helpful for getting a real insight into how much of the rest of the world perceives what's going on with climate change around the world. So it's just a couple minutes, 3 minutes. Let's look at this.
Has been the final negotiations. Let's take a look.
We met here under extraordinary circumstances, and the negotiations have been far from easy.
We had a significant emissions gap, and to address it, parties have collectively agreed to look for ways to increase actions continuously with the overall objective of closing that gap.
We've achieved movement on the global goal on adaptation, and we will be starting an ambitious work program, which is great.
We might not have received everything we wanted, but with the decisions adopted, we can leave Glasgow with strong confidence that this COP was a step in the right direction.
In the spirit of building within this international community and the purpose of what brings us together, we endorsed this decision, but we will keep fighting.
Today, we have not closed the 1.5 degree emissions gap, but we have set out a process that keeps it in reach, but only if each and every party does their part.
This agreement is keeping 1.5 alive, and although it's not perfect, it allows us to keep it alive.
There's something important for everybody in this text, and I think that we really need to set aside our differences, come together and send the message to the world that the world is expecting.
We don't have the perfect package, but we have the possible package.
Our work is not finished, and Brazil now looks forward to continue to engage with a view to implement Article 6.
I would like to remind us all that we have 98 months to halve global emissions. The difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is a death sentence for us.
The text represents the least worst outcome. The worst outcome would be to not agree it and to keep talking through next year and deter action for yet another year.
Friends, Glasgow ends today, but the real work begins now.
Let us adopt what we have. Let us close this session and continue the fight tomorrow and the day after and the weeks, months, and years ahead until the job is done.
COP26 also sees the finalization.
All right, I think you're seeing what we're getting at there. There's of course more that you could watch there. I always have a hard time cutting out stuff from this because this is one of my favorite topics here. So what you can see from the different perspectives, my favorite line was I think it was New Zealand, who said this is the least worst outcome, which is a feeling that often runs dominant in these COP meetings, is this idea that we are not succeeding, and which is true. I mean, we're not on a path to limit warming to 1.5. We're not on a path to limit warming to 2 degrees. The world is already at 1.2 degrees warming, experiencing significant disruptions that are highly destructive, particularly in many parts of the world. And we're on path to see those increase much more. But the Paris process, the Paris Agreement, the progress in Glasgow last year, the general consensus is, yes, we're moving it along. This is better than nothing. This is better than the previous. This is better than not being here and agreeing on what we're agreeing on. But the progress is very slow. That is, I think, critical. If you want to understand a global perspective on the climate crisis, on the Paris Agreement, I think that really summarizes it well, that this is the least worst outcome, that there's a lot of bad stuff that is causing damage, and the Paris Agreement is helping us, but it's not succeeding at the pace we need. And that you can see through the things that people are sharing and saying. I'm going to show some of this too. There's some great quotes from this. Okay, hold on, I'm going to pause. Okay, we'll see how much of this I show. It's 9 minutes long. I'm not going to show it all, but it's a collection of some of the really great quotes. Again, you're going to hear from a lot of global leaders, and I think this provides helpful context for thinking globally about this issue.
Everybody, welcome to COP. Welcome to Glasgow.
Dear friends, in the remaining days of COP26, the eyes of the world are focused on Glasgow. Glasgow can be the starting point of a new, more prosperous era, a greener, more resilient and sustainable future, one that is more just and more prosperous for all people.
We must listen, and we must act, and we must choose wisely. On behalf of these and future generations, I urge you, choose ambition, choose solidarity, choose to safeguard our future.
Failure to provide the critical finance and that of loss and damage is measured, my friends, in lives and livelihoods in our communities. This is immoral and it is unjust. Our people are watching and our people are taking note. And are we really going to leave Scotland without the resolve and the ambition that is sorely needed to save lives and to save our planet?
It comes down to this. The people alive now are the generation to come will look at this conference and consider one thing. Did that number stop rising and start to drop as a result of commitments made here? There's every reason to believe that the answer can be yes. If working apart, we are force powerful enough to destabilize our planet, surely working together, we are powerful enough to save it.
I believe in our ability to do what is right if we let ourselves feel it in our hearts. So for these next 2 weeks, let us feel it in our hearts. The children cannot live on words and empty promises. They are waiting for you to act. Please open your hearts and then act.
Have haven't delivered before. They have not been faithful in their promises. They have not been honest in fulfilling their commitments. They have not been trustworthy in making their pledges a reality. So, I have come here to tell you that we don't believe you. We don't believe that banks will suddenly put trillions of dollars on the table for climate action when rich countries have struggled since 2009 to raise $100 billion for the world's most vulnerable countries. We don't believe that promises made by financial companies to end deforestation will actually prevent trees from being cut or burnt down. We simply don't believe it. But I am here right now to ask business and finance leaders, show us your faithfulness, show us your trustworthiness, show us your honesty. I am here to say, prove us wrong. I'm actually here to beg you to prove us wrong. We desperately need you to prove us wrong.
I invite you to look.
My goodness. Sorry. Sometimes I watch these and I get emotional. At the inspiring young leaders. I brought Elizabeth Wathuti, the Kenyan activist that you heard talk and that guest spoke in one of my online classes last spring. And the other young woman, was she Ugandan, or I forgot where she was from. One of the powerful things from these COPs are the youth voices that are brought there, because the youth are inheriting the problems that my generation and older generations have created. And the youth have a unified and strong voice condemning my generation and condemning the leaders at these events for not taking greater action and for not acting more strongly. So if you want to understand what does the world think about this, outside my US bubble, outside the dysfunctional politics we have in America, what does the world think? Those are some of the voices that you hear there at this. I am begging you to prove us wrong, she says. What a powerful statement. So the world looks at this fairly differently than we do in the US. And I think that's helpful for us as Americans to understand that the dysfunctionality around climate change and around environmental issues that we have in the US is very different around the world, particularly when you get into the less developed world and there's much greater unity around the need to act and act urgently and respond to this. So what's going on now with the COPs? COP27 is coming up in Egypt this November. And a few of the issues that particularly are going to be on the table at the end of COP26, one of the things that was called for was increasing nationally determined contributions, again, increasing those voluntary goals that countries set. Normally, they revisit those every 5 years to increase ambition. This time, the idea was come back 1 year later with more ambitious goals, because what we have now isn't enough. Loss and damage, which we didn't really get into. Climate finance, getting us to that $100 billion a year and evening up the balance between adaptation and mitigation is going to be key. But a number of key concerns. Egypt's not very friendly towards human rights records. It's a very expensive resort town. So how is it going to be inclusive, including people from the global south, leaders from the global south, is going to be tricky. These are some of the things to look for at COP27 specifically. So I want to share a little bit about my story. So I co-direct a program called the Christian Climate Observers Program, or CCOP. And what we do is we bring emerging Christian leaders to the UN climate conferences as a way to mentor them in their climate leadership, to help them become more effective in their climate leadership by learning, by exposing them to global perspectives, by networking with people, key leaders on climate from around the world, and providing those epiphany moments, sort of those inspirational moments that really propel people into making a difference and their work back home. We found this to be an incredibly successful program. There's just a few details about it. It's actually open and available for people to apply. Well, by the time you're watching this, it will be too late for the 2022 program at COP27 in Egypt, because we'll have already had the applications closed for that. But you can look at this for 2023. COP28 will be in the United Arab Emirates, and you are welcome. Take a look at our program. Apply. Applications open June 1st, 2023 for the November 2023 COP. So feel free to look at that. But I want to share a little bit about my experience there. I've been to several of these COPs, and they are incredible experiences because you're sitting in the room with some of the world's most important leaders, period, but particularly leaders on climate. Now, this is at me, and this is the big conference hall that you saw in some of those videos too. This is Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, speaking. We actually had an astronaut from the International Space Station live stream in to the COP to talk with the body that was gathered there. This is my friend Lowell and I. They said sit anywhere in the back section. So we found the Holy See Contingency. That's the Vatican. their table was unoccupied, so we sat there, and that was a humorous experience. One of the things you'll see at COPs is that a lot of the world's countries put up these pavilion booths where they showcase what they're doing to respond to climate change. So you see France, Brazil, India, China, and they host lectures and workshops and discussions at their pavilions to talk about how they're responding to climate change. But it's not just the big countries, smaller ones too. Thailand, Rwanda. This is the Senegal, the tiny country of Senegal hosts a pavilion. And you see lots of people gather here. Like this is literally, you have 40,000 people from every country on the planet gathered here to try to address this problem and say, how do we work on this together? So there's a real collaborative spirit on how do we solve this problem. This is the Pacific Island nations came together to host a pavilion together. They had a lot of interesting talks there. Some key world leaders there. I saw Arnold Schwarzenegger speak at one at COP23. This is John Kerry, who's now a former senator, former presidential candidate, who now is the US climate envoy, talking in Madrid. And this is, of course, Vice President Al Gore, who we all know who he is. This is him meeting with our CCOP team. So our team last year actually got to sit down for an hour with him and talk about climate change, including Sarah Houghton student, who got to meet him and talk with him for a long time. So incredible opportunity to network and meet with people. Sometimes there's a lot of space for informal gatherings. This is a meeting with George Marshall, one of the world's leading experts on climate communication, just picking his brain about how can we more effectively communicate about climate change. This is a pop-up worship session we did in Paris during COP21, where every day at noon, some Christians would come together and just have sort of like a spontaneous pop-up. Let's sing worship songs together and sort of bring Jesus into the mix of what's going on here, because certainly we need God's help in solving this crisis. So let's be a Christian witness amidst this. Artistic displays. This is this amazing photojournal essay of these indigenous women in the Amazon. These great opportunities, art displays, billboards, other things that is a common thing that you see. This is at COP23 in Bonn, right after President Trump pulled us out of the Paris Agreement. A coalition of states and cities came together to build this display just outside the COP venue to say we are still in to try to fulfill the US's climate goals. And incredible opportunity to meet with people who are on the front line of climate impacts. This is my friend Tefue, who I've mentioned before. This gentleman is a former prime minister of Kiribati. This is a minister in the World Council of Churches, Bishop James Bhagwan, who I've had speak in my classes before via Zoom, who's a real leader in the community. I had an incredible story with this man from the Solomon Islands, Nigel. I won't get into that story now, but ask me about it sometimes. But an amazing opportunity to meet with and really hear firsthand the stories of people who are on the frontline impacts of climate change. And of course, there's always lots of marches and protests and demonstrations that are going on throughout the city, sometimes inside carefully orchestrated ones inside the COP venue that are more respectful and calmer. Outside the COP venue, you have big marches and banners and stuff. But typically there is a very large segment of civil society that comes to, I think it's 500,000 people participating in this march in Madrid. And one thing that we have tried to do is to always organize these faith-based events around the city. So this is one in Paris where we organized a full day session exploring how do Christians engage with climate change. That included the General Secretary of the World Evangelical Alliance and Katharine Hayhoe, one of the top climate scientists in the country, who are talking about that experience. This is something similar we did in Madrid at COP25. This is a chance we had to pray over Secretary Tintero, who is the head of the World Evangelical Alliance. And here's a faith event in Notre Dame at COP21 that we went to. So there's always a faith contingent that really works at, because of course the connections between climate change and our faith are significant, and outside the US context are fairly obvious to Christians around the world. Hence the reason why the head of the whole world evangelical community was himself a negotiator for the country of the Philippines there. The connections to non-Americans is pretty clear, and the world is interested and involved in a big way. So I'm always very encouraged to come to these, get out of my North American context, and to see the way that world Christians really mobilize around climate change as an important topic is a great encouragement to me on a personal and spiritual basis. And this is my wife got to join me at COP20 in Paris, which was so fantastic for her to get that experience. And Lauren Bechtel, who was a Houghton student, first Houghton student to go to a COP, and joined us in Paris for that event. Was a really great experience. But these are really cool experiences. And I do hope that you track a little bit what goes on in November in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for COP27 and follow along with some of that. Hopefully this has been informational and interesting for you. And again, my hopeful takeaway from this is that you'll have sort of a better understanding of what global perspectives on climate change and how we work to resolve this issue, what those kind of look like, and how they really differ from a lot of the American kind of context. Okay, that's it for now.